So, can you think about some instances in which we would use an alternative lead? Because we wouldn't use, so we know that the summary and the hard news lead is for serious and critical stories that we are intending to get straight to the point, to talk about the action of a news story, and its relevance to the readers immediately. But there are cases in which we will write alternative news leads, and what stories would this apply to? Feature stories. We can write feature stories, we can start them differently because they are not as serious or intense as hard news stories, but they're still valuable and important. They're just human interest stories, right? These are stories that talk about our daily lives and experiences, and those stories are equally important, but not as critical as hard news stories. So let's look at this example. City officials Wednesday night debated the possibility of a tax increase to erase the city's 6.7 million deficit. Here's an alternative lead. I want to know what you think. City officials are going to need a pretty big rabbit's foot to keep the city's budget in the black. Mayor Sabrina Dallas told council during a budget meeting Wednesday night it will take a lot of luck to keep the city out of a financial hole next year. Does that alternative lead work?
No.
It doesn't. Why?
It's too big.
And this is an important matter. We don't want to play off in talking about something about a rabbit's foot, keeping it in the black, when we're literally talking about taxes increasing and it's putting us in a deficit. This is an important hard news story that an alternative lead would not work for. So this gives credence to what I was saying, that for more hard news and more serious pieces, an alternative lead or some other type of lead may not work. That's why we do the inverted pyramid style and the summary news lead for more hard news, but we can do alternative leads for feature stories. Let's look at what they say about alternative leads. Now, why would an alternative lead be good to use in a feature story or in a story that's not as serious as a 6.7 tax budget? Entertainment. It allows us to be versatile and avoid the trap of blindly following the inverted pyramid for every single story. And again, appropriateness is important. Knowing when to use an alternative lead and what stories it applies to is significantly important. You want to think about the type of story and the type of publication that you are publishing in, or the type of story that you're writing. That's going to dictate what type of lead is necessary. Critics argue, though, that alternative leads are jello journalism. This is basically another term for fluff. But some people feel like the alternative lead is inappropriate. It's literary and it fails to emphasize actual news. But people who embrace the alternative lead said that it can make for a better turnout of a story or a better storytelling device for feature stories and stories that aren't about critical matters, like a feature story piece about a hometown hero. Alternatively, may be a great way to invite the reader into that story. Let's look at this example. Michelle Woods considers herself an intelligent, educated woman. She reads the information provided by the Grand Rapids Township Board. She talked to friends and neighbors, and she intends to vote Tuesday in a special election that could determine the township's future. I just want to do what is best, says Woods. Like many residents, though, she's not sure what that is. An unusual battle is being fought in the smallest of Kent County Township, a raggedy-shaped 16 square miles set cheek to jowl against the city's Grand Rapids. The battle is not about zoning, the more typical flashpoint of local politics, nor is it about leaf-burning ordinances or grassroots laws in the suburb of nearly 1,100 people. This battle is about what the community can do to keep from being nibbled into pieces of the annex. How do you feel about this alternative lead? Does it work? What's the main point of this story? The main point of this story is at the end. The battle is about what the community can do to keep from being nibbled into pieces. It's about annexation. They went through all of this to say what it's not about, to tell us what it's about. It's about this community being swallowed up by annexation, right? All of this is what? Fluff. So this is not a good example. This is yet another example of why an alternative lead does not work for critical stories. And the reason why I keep showing you negative examples is that you know and can identify when something is confusing you. It took you a while to get to this point because you was like, I don't even know what this story is about. And that's what your readers are going to do. If you're confused, your readers are going to be confused. And this alternative lead starting out about what all this woman did to say that she intended to vote for about annexation for her community was irrelevant. Thus, it got lost in this alternative lead. So knowing when is critical when determining if you should use an alternative lead, when it's appropriate. And in this case, again, it's not appropriate. Let's look at some examples. So we talked about the buried or delayed lead in the last presentation. And most of the time, it can begin with an interesting example of a story that sets the story in motion, that sets the theme, that pulls out the theme. And then the nut graph that follows it puts the story immediately into context, gives us the details that we need to move from a single example to highlight a more general issue. And the buried or delayed lead is a good lead for when you're trying to show how people are affected by some greater thing. Like you use an example of a woman who was affected, a small anecdote of a woman who was affected by the virus of the coronavirus financial impact, right? To move into talking about all of the financial consequences that Americans are facing because of the coronavirus. She becomes our example to set this story into precedence. So it makes for the buried or delayed lead makes for a good anecdote to use to show how people are impacted, to personify a story or an issue. Let's look at this example. Modern hunters rarely become more famous than Jim Zumba, a mustachioed, barrel-chested outdoor entrepreneur who lives in a log cabin near Yellowstone National Park. He has spent much of his life writing for prominent outdoor magazines, delivering lectures across the county, and starring in cable TV shows about big game hunting in the West. Zumba's fame, however, has turned to black-bordered infamy within America's gun culture, and his multimedia success has come undone. It all happened in the past week after he publicly criticized the use of military-style assault rifles by hunters, especially those gunning for prairie dogs. How do you all feel about that lead? Okay. This would be considered a good example of an alternative lead, because we are giving credence to this man. Now, he's criticizing the use of military assault rifles by hunters. So this isn't really an urgent or pressing issue in society, but it is an important one. It doesn't really affect everybody on a nationwide level, right? But it is an important and serious issue. Thus, it's still a feature-worthy story. You get where I'm going? And the reason why we're even bringing up this man is because why? He's famous for what he does. He writes these critical pieces about outdoors. He delivers lectures. And his success is becoming undone because he has criticized the use of assault rifles in game and hunting. This makes for a good feature story. Some people may agree with you, Brittany. It's a little too wordy. We can cut out some things. I think we can actually, if you wanted to, you can do without the first paragraph. Yeah. And just use his name, right? But what does this first paragraph do for us? Give us color about the person. And because this is more of a feature style story, those are the type of descriptors that people are going to know about the people in the story. This man is an avid outdoorsman. He endorses outdoors and he gives lectures about farming and hunting and all of these things. And he has made a critical decision to criticize people's use of assault rifles. So it's probably was the writer probably felt it was urgent to give credence to the type of man he was, to show that, look, he's into the hunting game and he is criticizing the use of assault rifles. So they was trying to add that effect. But I agree with you. Some other people might agree with you. We can do without that first paragraph. Either way, you all are thinking about alternative leads. Do we use them when they are appropriate and when they aren't? Quotation lead. What, just by definition, what would a quotation lead be?
A direct quote.
We start with a direct quote. Now, most critics and journalists do not advise starting with a quotation because why? It can be taken out of context. We don't know who you're talking to. And unless the quotation is self-explanatory and can sum up the entire story in a quote, because you're using it as your lead sentence, right? So it needs to be able to get to the point briefly. It can't be long. It needs to be a quote that summarizes everything that you're trying to say that's most important in the story. And that's hard to do with a quote. So when you do, you're rarely going to ever use a quote to begin a news story, a feature story with, or any type of story, because quotes rarely get to the point of the meat and potatoes of a story or set it in motion that way. So you want to be sure, if you're going to use a quote, that it sums it up, that it's brief, it's concise, and it don't need explaining. Like if somebody's giving a quote and they said, she said, who is the she? Who is the it? Right. So it needs to be extremely clear, right? Let's look at this example. The water was rising so fast and the bank was so muddy and slippery, I just didn't think I could get away from that torrent of water. That's how a Bremerton man described his ordeal just before rescue workers used a utility truck to pluck him out of a tree he climbed to escape a flash flood during Monday's thunderstorm. Does that quote work at the beginning?
Yeah.
Tell me why.
Because he's basically describing the situation. Well, that's what he said.
But what's happening though? Do we even know what's happening?
No, you really don't.
We don't. And see, that's the problem. What water? The bank? Was it what were you inside of a bank? Was it a outdoors bank? What torrent of water? And we don't learn until the last couple of lines that he's talking about he escaped a flash flood during Monday's thunderstorm. That needs to go where? At the beginning. A Bremerton man who was rescued from a tree he climbed to escape the flash flood Monday night said, then offer your quote.
You was talking about, was it relevant at all in the sentence?
Yes, we're talking about alternative leads. And so one alternative lead that you can use, like we just said, is using a quote, right? But like I was just saying, that if you're going to use a quote as an alternative lead, it needs to be specific. We don't even know who the I was in that quote. You get what I'm saying? So if you do use a quote in the beginning, it may need to come second. You just have to think about those things, unless it's extremely specific and can summarize your main point of your news article opening up. That's hard to do with a quotation in a lead. Let's look at question leads. Critics say news stories should never answer questions. Critics say the news story should answer questions, not ask them. But sometimes this can be extremely impactful. Now, granted, asking questions can be a bit cliche, especially if you're asking a question about something that readers already would know the answer to. Don't ask readers something they already know the answer to. But they must be brief, simple, and provocative that invites the reader into the story and makes them want to dig deeper into the news story. It needs to be that provocative. Readers should absolutely feel compelled to answer whatever it is that you're asking, because that's going to be the reason that they decide to go on further. But you want to avoid abstract or complicated questions that require a great deal of explanation. You don't want to do that to your reader. If you got to take 2-3 other sentences to explain what you're even asking, you probably shouldn't be asking it. You probably should be explaining it to your readers. And also, it should concern a controversial issue that readers are familiar with, because that's another way that you invite them into the story. If they aren't familiar with what you're talking about, then they don't even find that question relevant to them. And finally, you want to avoid questions that may discourage readers from continuing reading, like this example here. Have you thought lately about going to prison? Someone was swindled today who will be swindled tomorrow. That's a poor example of using the question, because first of all, nobody is thinking about going to, nobody wants to think about going to prison. I mean, we all have, but no, that's a negative disposition.
We don't wake up and think about it every day.
Right, you don't want to wake up and think about going to jail. But finally, it feels almost if we're making light of going to jail.
Right.
You know, that's a very serious thing. And some people are actually facing serious challenges behind bars. There are a lot of issues with the prison system, and you're going to say, have you thought lately about going to jail? Yeah, that's kind of tacky. Look at this one. Gainesville. How much is an inch of height worth? Nearly $900 a year in a salary, a new study finds. How do you feel about that one? That's better.
Yeah.
Because we're asking people, how much is an inch of height worth? You immediately said, huh? Didn't you?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Because it piques your inquisitive nature. It makes you want to, what are you talking about? How much is an inch of height worth? But clearly,
It's worth something.
it's worth $900 a year in a salary. Now you're about to read this because it might be relevant to who? You. This is a good example of one, because the question, it wasn't vague or abstract. It piqued your interest because you were like, why would an inch of height be worth money?
Right.
Right. So you were compelled to go further. Suspenseful leads. What would a suspenseful lead do? It raises questions in the reader's minds. It hints,
What will happen next?
yes, what's going to happen next. And in the same, what's going to happen next. And in the same way, it compelled you to read further. Because that's the whole point of leads, right? The whole point of leads is to summarize this news article, but to also encourage your readers to move further. And alternative leads are ways that we can do that for feature stories. Sometimes some hard news stories allow for that type of space, but as we've seen in these first two examples, it's about the type of story and the type of publication. Look at this example. I love this example. It is the fire bell that signals the beginning of each firefighter's day. It is the same bell that summons firefighters to action. And it is the same bell that marks their last alarm. How do you feel about that lead?
Yeah.
It's a good lead. Like, I don't even know what they're about to get ready to talk about, but the fact that this is the same bell that calls them to action, the bell that when they die, this bell is signaled, the beginning of their day, this is a great lead that builds suspense to what's next. Like, what are you going to be talking about? And some might argue it's not as suspenseful as we would like it to be, but it's still a driving lead that keeps you reading further into the story. And a suspenseful lead doesn't have to be scary. It can be mysterious. It could be driving in that way, compelling you to read further. Descriptive leads. What do descriptive leads do?
I say they more of a visual.
More of a visual. It puts the reader into action. It allows you to paint a vivid picture of what's happening in the news story. This is my favorite example. I don't know why writing is underlined right now, but Parkinson's disease worked on Goldie Thomas like a slow-moving robber, taking away things one at a time, baling hay, birthing calves, working the controls of the John Deere tractor. Each lost activity seemed to pull Thomas further from what she was, a Midwestern-born farm girl. Raised in the 1920s on a farm near tiny Lena, Illinois, the tremors and faulty sense of balance started 25 years ago, long after Thomas moved from Illinois to a farm in northern Brown County. First, she surrendered garden chores, such as tending to strawberry and potato plants. Then she had to give up handling equipment, such as riding a snowmobile to far-flung parts of her farm in Washington Township. It was the tremors, she said. This is good. This is really good. But let's talk about why it's good.
Because it's basically gave everything down to detail.
Vivid descriptions. And what did they use for what parts of speech did they use? Out of your verbs, nouns, adjectives, what part of the speech did they use to bring this story to life?
I see a lot of verbs and adjectives.
You don't see a lot of adjectives?
Well, not.
You see a lot of verbs. Worked on Goldie Thomas, baling hay, birthing calves, working some controls, surrendered, give up handling equipment, riding a snowmobile. She didn't bog this down with adjectives or adverbs. She filled it up with verbs that allow us to see the action that was being take place. We see how active Goldie was, and we ultimately feel sorry for Goldie at the end of this because we can see how enriching her lifestyle was prior to her getting the tremors. This is my favorite example. Then there's the shocker lead. What does the shocker lead do? It hits you. It don't surprise. Well, yes, it's. You are exactly correct. It's an immediate surprise upon immediate impact. It immediately takes you aback. The suspenseful lead builds your suspension, right? But the shocker lead hits you in the gut. This is a good example. She had been raped. She was pregnant and she was poor, and Rosa was 9. That gave her one more reason to want an abortion. That's a good lead.
Yeah.
That's a great lead for a shocker lead. We did not expect Rosa to be 9 years old. And we definitely didn't expect this conversation to be about an abortion.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's a direct address lead. This is the last one, right? If I'm saying it's a direct address lead, it's doing what?
Directed straight towards
The who?
audience.
The audience. And I like these type of leads. Look at this example. If you think you're too smart to fall for an internet scam, you're probably kidding yourself. Is that a good lead? Yes, because it's relevant to anybody who's going to read that story. And I'm going to click on that news story because I'm like, okay,
I'll be on it.
exactly. If you just spend another Valentine's Day alone and lonely, the state of Maryland can hook you up. That's another good lead, right?
Yeah.
Because it's going to directly speak to the single people in Maryland. Now, she didn't have to throw it in our face like that.
Wondering, like, how can you hook me up?
Right. It compels you to dig deeper because it has made it personal to you and the things that you're going through.
Right.
Now, let's switch gears and talk about headlines. These are this is about 5 slides. But headlines are just important as leads because they go together. Why do they go together?
Because headlines is basically I want to say a subscript almost.
Okay. Now, the only time you can say the headline is a title is when you're defining a headline. Other than that, you don't ever need to say, that's the title of that news story. Don't ever say that. But if you are giving a description of what a headline is, you can say, it's the title of a news story, right? But what purpose do headlines write? Because the lead is the most difficult to write, but the headline is most important. And why?
The headline should be what catches your attention.
Boom. It catches the reader's attention, but also SEO strategy, search engine optimization, right? When you're looking up information that is relevant to you, what do you type in Google? Keywords. So your headline needs to work the same way.
Your headlines will work as keywords.
Your headline is supposed to work as keywords, so that your readers can immediately, you need to be thinking about what your readers would type in on Google. I heard about a Hattiesburg man died Sunday. That's equivalent to a what? A headline. These are the things that you need to think about. And they aren't easy to write either. As I've told you, this will be the hardest thing that you master. But once you master this, you will become a great writer. And they are only 5 to 10 words. That's it. They contain a subject, verb, and an object. And we're going to go over a couple of examples, and we're going to go over a couple of rules that apply when writing headlines. But also, did you know that we don't capitalize every word in the headline?
Right.
Yes. People have been writing headlines wrong for ages. Headlines are written just like you would write a sentence, case-wise, upper and lower case. You only capitalize proper nouns and the first word. Everything else is lowercase. President threatens veto of next tax bill. That's how you write a headline. Now, let's look at some more things. Sometimes a verb or part of a verb form is understood and not explicitly stated. Midville man charged with larceny. Jones on team's final roster. What verb is missing?
For
Both of them. It's a verb missing. Is. We don't write those. You have never seen is in a headline. You won't see it either. Midville man, because we write in more active tense. You get it? Midville man charged. Jones on team's final roster. We write actively, not passively.
That's crazy because most of mine would have put is.
Now you can, I'm telling you, you're going to go back to school and be able to check some people. Headlines you must completely understand the article before you write the headlines. Why?
How you going?
Exactly. And we've been talking about organized writing all of this time. And sometimes your headline can include a theme. It can bring out a thematic message. And you won't know that until after you've crafted a story. So you write it last. Concrete wording, active voice. Do not repeat the same information in your story in your headlines. Now, one word may be okay. Like if you said, Hattiesburg man died. Okay, there's not many ways we can say died. And we don't use euphemisms, and we don't say Hattiesburg man passed away. We use direct language. So we said he died. So it's okay to put died in the headline and died in the lead sentence. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but most of the time you do not want to use the same wording. And it's based on the main idea of the story. So most of the time you're leading your headline, this is why we're doing it together. They go back and hand in hand with each other. And most importantly, don't use information in your headline that's not in your story. What is this called? Misleading. And if you want some people to stop following you and reading your news story and your news station, you got one time to do this. It's scamming. It's a form of scamming and lying. If it's not in the news story, don't put it in the headline. Don't be ambiguous. Be clear and concise. Don't insinuate or point to things that are not in your story. Don't be biased in your headline is what they're telling you here. And don't capitalize every word. We just talked about this. This is one of the things that I hate. I told you all I write for Black with No Chaser, and we do this all the time. And I tell them, like, I get it, this is our style, but this is not real journalism. Let's look at these examples. Use present tense verbs for headlines that refer to past and present events. What tense are you going to use? Present tense. Why do we use present tense? And even if it isn't, we want to make it relevant to our readers now. Exactly. Harry demanded a vote. Harry demands a vote. Even though the story will say on Tuesday, blah, blah, blah. That's what Harry did. He was demanding a vote. For future tense, Use infinitive forms of verbs such as to go, to run, rather than will. Smith will run for city councilman. Smith to run for city councilman. You get it? Make it more present. Make it more active. Don't use an and thee. You hadn't seen an and thee, have you? And you won't. Mayor and council meet on budget for next year. Mayor, council agree to cut new budget. This is the way we've written news story for years. And until you're an avid reader, you won't know that the comma stands for what? And. That's why it's important for you to know those things as a journalist. In the place of and, we use a comma. Never started with the verb. These are just basic rules. Use punctuation sparingly. The only time you're going to use a punctuation if it's an exclamation point or a question mark or a comma. But that's it. Or a colon if you're doing like an editorial piece. Avoid using little known names. Again, we don't emphasize people who are not well known, who are not prominent in society, in headlines or leads. You're starting to see the congruency. Use words for their exact meanings. We've been saying this for all of the semester. At the beginning of the semester, we went over that whole GSP phase of use words for their exact meanings. Do not use pronouns alone and unidentified, especially not in a headline. Be accurate. Avoid using label headlines. Avoid words like man and woman. Use descriptive and localized words like Hattiesburg man, former Jackson woman. Search for keywords. We just talked about this. So, for you all, you're going to watch this short video presentation and you are going to use it to help you do your assignment.